My brother took everything my parents built, then the document in the drawer changed everything. My name is Elena Marchetti. I'm 39 years old. When my father died, I was the one who sat with him at the end. Not my brother Dominic. Not my mother, who was too broken by that point to remain in the room. It was me, sitting in a hospital chair with my father's hand in mine, watching his breathing change and then slow and then stop, holding on to him while the nurses moved quietly at the edges of the room and the monitors recorded the end of a life that had been, in its way, extraordinary. My father, Carlo Marchetti, built a restaurant supply business from a single delivery truck and 30 years of work. He started when he was 26 and he was still working at 71, not because he needed to but because the work was who he was. By the time he died in April 2016, Marchetti Supply had 14 employees, a warehouse in Passaic, New Jersey, a client list that included over 200 restaurants from Manhattan to Princeton, and an annual revenue that had been growing consistently for a decade. He built it without investors, without partners, without anyone who had a claim on it except the family he had built it for. When he died, he had a will. The will left the business to both Dominic and me, equally. The house in Clifton, where my parents had lived since 1984, to my mother for her lifetime. The personal property divided between his 3 grandchildren, Dominic's 2 sons and my daughter, with specific items designated for each. It was clear. It was fair. It was what my father had intended. What happened to it was not what he intended. I am going to tell you what happened. All of it. And I am going to tell you about the document I found in a drawer in my father's office. A drawer I opened 14 months after he died, while cleaning out the space for the new tenant. A drawer that had a piece of paper in it that my father had written in 2014, and that he had apparently decided to keep rather than formalize, and that turned out to be the most important piece of paper in the story of what happened to everything my parents built. If you have ever watched someone take advantage of grief, your grief or someone else's, stay with me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I need to start with Dominic, because you cannot understand what happened without understanding who he was and what the history between us had been. Dominic is 5 years older than me. He is 44 now. He grew up in the same house in Clifton that I grew up in, ate at the same table, went to the same church, watched the same father build the same business that we both inherited. We did not experience any of it the same way. Dominic was the son. In a family with a specific cultural inheritance of ours, Southern Italian, Catholic, organized around certain convictions about roles and expectations and what was owed to whom. Being the son carried weight that being the daughter did not carry in the same way. Not in my parents' overt behavior. My parents were not people who said daughters matter less. But in the accumulated small assumptions of a household, in the specific ways that things were organized and expectations were distributed, Dominic's role as the son carried a priority that was real even when it was never stated. He was expected to take over the business. This was not a decision my father made formally. It was an assumption that developed so gradually and so naturally that by the time Dominic was in his 30s and working alongside my father at Marchetti Supply, no one had ever specifically said Dominic will inherit the business, but everyone behaved as though this were settled. I had a different path. I went to Rutgers, studied accounting, spent several years at a firm in Newark before moving to my own practice. I was good at numbers in the way my father had been good at numbers, intuitively, practically, with the specific understanding of someone who had grown up watching a business be built and had absorbed the financial logic of it before she could name what she was absorbing. My father was proud of me. I want to say that clearly because I want this story to be accurate and not just flattering to myself. He was proud of both of us, in different ways and for different reasons. He was proud of Dominic for being in the business. He was proud of me for building something separate and real. What he did not anticipate, or what he anticipated and did not manage in time, was what would happen when he was gone, and Dominic's assumption of primacy met my legal claim of equality. My father's illness was pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in October 2015. The timeline the doctors gave us was careful and guarded in the way that oncologists learn to be careful and guarded, but the substance was clear. We were talking about months rather than years. My father spent those months doing what he had always done. Working, more days than not. Managing the business. Talking to clients. Making sure things were in order. What he did not do, or did not fully do, was have the specific conversations with Dominic and me about the future of the business that might have prevented what happened after. I understand why. Having those conversations would have required him to say things that were uncomfortable, to tell Dominic that the business was equally Elena's and that Dominic's expectation of primacy was not reflected in the legal documents, and to tell me that Dominic was going to resist this and that I would need to be prepared for that resistance. These were hard things to say to your children when you were dying. Most people do not say them. My father did not say them. He left a will instead. The will said what it said. He trusted that would be enough. It was not enough. My father died on a Thursday in April 2016. He was 73 years old. The months after his death were the months in which grief takes its specific form, not the dramatic grief of movies but the grinding, administrative grief of reality. Death has paperwork. Death has logistics. Death has the specific task of notifying everyone who needs to know and making all the arrangements that a life requires at its end. My mother, Teresa, was 81 years old and in fragile health. She had been managing her own decline during the same period she had been managing her husband's, and the end of my father's illness also marked a sharp acceleration in her own. She was not capable of managing anything in those months. She needed managing herself. Dominic took over. This was natural. My brother took everything my parents built. The one with the longest relationship changed everything. In the immediate aftermath of my father's death, his taking charge was appropriate, and I was when my father died. I was in New York, where I lived with my husband Robert and our daughter Sophia. I was managing my own grief while managing my own household and my own professional obligations. Sitting in a hospital chair with my father's hand capable in Clifton, watching his breathing change and then what I did not track carefully enough, holding on during those while the nurses moved was what taking charge of the room actually meant, and the monitors recorded the end of a life that had been in its way. The first indication that something was wrong came 6 months after my father died. Built a restaurant supply business. I had been calling Dominic regularly about the business, 30 years about the process of formally transferring the ownership structure to reflect the will, about what the books looked like, about what decisions needed to be made for the upcoming fiscal year. By the time he died in April 2016, Marchetti Supply had 14 employees. They were the normal warehouse in Passaic, New Jersey, who had a client list that included over 200 restaurants to figure out how to manage it together, and an annual revenue that had been growing consistently for a decade. Questions about formalization were consistently evasive. There was always a reason why the ownership transfer had not yet been processed. When he died, the attorney was handling it. The will left the business wasn't both right. Dominic and me. The business needed stability. The house in Clifton, where my parents had lived since 1984, I accepted this longer than I should have, to my mother for her because lifetime. I trusted him, the and personal because property divided because the combination of trust and grief Dominic's is a specific vulnerability that is easy to exploit and hard to defend against when you are inside. It was clear. In October 2016, 6 months after my father died, I called my father's attorney, what happened to a man named Paul Ferretti, who had handled his affairs for many years, tell you what and asked him directly about the status of the estate, and I am going to tell you about the document Paul told me the estate had been formally closed in June. I opened 14 months about the business ownership cleaning out the space for the new tenant. He said the transfer that had a piece of paper in it that my father had written now in Dominic's name, and that he had apparently decided to keep rather than formalize. And that turned out to be the most important piece of paper to explain. In the story of what happened. He told me that Dominic had provided documentation. If you have ever watched someone take advantage of subsequent decision about or someone else after the formal will was executed, tell me in the comments where your watching been presented to him. I need to start my father's death and had been used to complete the ownership transfer without dividing the interest as the will specified. The history between us had been. Documentation. Dominic is 5 years older than me. He was quiet. He is 44 now. Then he grew up in the same handwritten letter that I grew up in, signed by your father, dated February 2016. The same father built the same business that we both inherited. It was his intention. We did not experience to any of it the same way. February 2016. In a family with a specific cultural inheritance of ours, I have never seen this letter. Catholic, organized around certain convictions about roles and expectations, and what was owed to whom, from Dominic, being the son carried aware that being the daughter did not carry with this information for a moment. In my parents' overt this letter. My parents were not people who said daughters matter less. but in the accumulated small assumptions of a household,
did you verify
in
the
the specific ways
against
things
other
were organized
samples
and
of my father's
expectations were
handwriting?
distributed? Dominic's
I
role
asked,
as the son
another
carried a
pause.
priority that was real.
The
Even when
notarization
it was
is
never
typically
stated.
considered
He was
sufficient,
expected
he
to
said.
take over the
I
business.
thanked him.
This
I
was
hung
not a
up.
decision my father
Then
made
I drove
formally.
to Clifton.
It was
and
an
went to
assumption
my
that
father's
developed
office
so
at the
gradually
warehouse
and so naturally
my
that by
father's
the time
office was
Dominic
at the
was in
back
his
of the
30s
warehouse
and
on
working
Halsey
alongside
Street.
my father at
It was a
Marchetti
practical
Supply.
space.
No
A
one had
desk,
ever specifically
filing
said
cabinets,
Dominic will
a
inherit
computer
the business,
that he had
but
used
everyone
reluctantly,
behaved
as
as
though
though had
this
never
were settled.
fully displaced
I
the
had a
paper
different
systems he
path.
trusted.
I
The
went to
walls had
Rutgers,
photographs,
studied accounting,
the delivery truck he
spent
had started
several
with,
years at
the
a firm in
warehouse the
Newark
day they
before
moved in,
moving to my
family
own
pictures,
practice.
a framed
I was good
photograph
at
of my
numbers and the
parents
way
on
my
their
father
40th
had been
wedding
good at
anniversary.
numbers. The
Intuitively,
office had been used by Dominic
with a
since my
specific
father
understanding
died.
of someone
He had
who had
maintained
grown
it
up
largely
watching
as
a
it
business
was
be built, and
my
had
father's
absorbed the
presence was
financial
too
logic
recent
of it
and
before
too
she could
large
name
for
what she was
dramatic
absorbing.
reorganization.
My father
But
was
he had
proud
also
of
been
me.
through the files.
I want to say
and
that
had
clearly
organized
because I
things in
want this
ways
story
that
to be
reflected
accurate
his management.
and not just
I
flattering
was
to
looking
myself.
for something
He was
specific.
proud of both of
My
us
father had
in
kept a
different
drawer
ways
in his
and
desk
for different
that he called
reasons.
his private
He
drawer.
was proud of Dominic
private
for being
from the
in the
family.
business.
He was not a
He was
secretive
proud of
man,
me for
but
building
private
something
in the sense
separate
of being
and
where
real.
he kept things
What he
that
did
were
not
personal
anticipate,
rather than
or
operational.
what he anticipated
Letters,
and did not manage in
photographs,
time, was what would
the
happen
specific
when he was
accumulation
gone, and
of a
Dominic's
life's
assumption
important
of
papers
privacy
that are too
met my
important
legal
to
claim
file
of
and
equality.
too important
My
to throw
father's
away.
illness was
I opened the
pancreatic
drawer.
cancer.
Most
Diagnosed
of what was
in
in
October
it, I expected.
2015.
Letters
The
from
timeline the
suppliers
doctors
going
gave us
back
was
decades.
careful and guarded
His
in the way that
father's
oncologists
immigration
learn to be
papers.
careful and guarded.
My parents'
But the
marriage
substance was
certificate.
clear. We were
The
talking
birth
about
certificates
months
of
rather
Dominic
than
and
years.
me,
My
which he
father
had
kept
kept
in
those
those drawer
months
since
doing
we were
what he
born,
had always
and
done.
at the back of the drawer,
Working
under the
more
birth
days than
certificates,
not.
a piece of
Managing
paper,
the business,
folded twice,
talking to
written
clients,
on Marchetti
making
Supply
sure
letterhead,
things were in order.
dated September
What he did not
2014,
do, or did not
18
fully
months
do,
before the
was
letter
have the
Dominic had
specific
presented,
conversations
2
with
years
Dominic
before
and
my
me
father
about the
died.
future of the business
I
that might have
unfolded
prevented what happened
My
after.
father's handwriting
I understand
was distinctive.
why.
He
Having
wrote
those
the way he
conversations
did
would have
everything,
required him to
with
say things that
directness
were
and
uncomfortable.
without ornamentation.
To tell Dominic that
The
the
letters
business
were
was
large
equally
and
Elena's,
slightly
and
irregular.
that Dominic's
The
expectation
handwriting
of
of
privacy
someone
was
who
not
had not
reflected
had much
in the legal
formal schooling,
documents, but who
and
had
to tell me
developed
that
his own
Dominic
system
was going
that
to
was
resist
entirely
this,
readable.
and that I would need to
The
be prepared
document
for that
was
resistance.
not a formal legal
These were
instrument.
hard things to say
It was
to your
written in the
children
first person
when you were dying.
in Italian and
Most
English
people
mixed
do
in
not
the way
say
my
them.
father always
My
mixed
father
them when
did
he was
not
writing
say them.
something personal
He
and
left a
important,
will instead,
and it was addressed to
the
no
will
one
said what
specifically,
it said.
but clearly
He
intended
trusted
as a record.
that would be enough.
He wrote that he had
It
been
was
thinking
not
about
enough.
the business and what
My
would
father
happen to
died
it
on a
after
Thursday
he was gone.
in April 2016.
He wrote that he had discussed this with his
He
wife
was
Teresa,
73
and that he
years
wanted to
old.
put down what they
The
had
months
agreed,
after his
in
death
case
were the months
anything
in
was
which
not
grief
clear
takes
from
its
the formal
specific
documents.
form. Not
He
the
wrote
dramatic
that the
grief of
business was
movies,
to
but
go
the grinding
equally to
to
both
administrative
children,
grief of
that
reality.
this was
Death
non-negotiable,
has paperwork.
that he had watched
Death
his own
has
father divide his
logistics.
estate
Death
unequally
has
among
the
his
specific
children,
task
and
of
had seen the
notifying
damage
everyone
it did
who
to a
needs to
family,
know,
and
that
making
he was
all the
not going to
arrangements
do
that
the
a
same
life
thing.
requires at
He
its
wrote,
end.
specifically,
My mother, Teresa,
Dominic will
was
want more
81
than his
years
share,
old and in
he has
fragile health.
always wanted
She
more
had been
than his
managing
share.
her own decline
This is
during the
not
same
a
period
criticism
she had
of
been
him.
managing her
It is who
husband's,
he is.
and the end of my
But I
father's
wanted on
illness
record
also
that the
marked a
business
sharp
is for both of
acceleration
them,
in
and
her
that
own.
my intention
She was
cannot be
not
changed
capable
by
of
anything
managing
Dominic
anything
says after
in
I
those
am gone,
months.
no matter
She
how he
needed
frames it or
managing
what
herself.
documents he produces.
Dominic took over.
That sentence,
This was natural.
no matter what
Documents he produces. My father had anticipated this. In September 2014, more than a year before his diagnosis, he had seen the shape of what was coming, and he had written it down, and he had kept it in the private drawer. But he had not formalized it. He had not taken it to Paul Ferretti and made it part of the legal record. He had put it in the drawer and left it there, and by the time he was dying the drawer was not something he had thought to mention. I photographed the document with my phone. Then I called my attorney. My attorney, a woman named Judith Morris who had handled various professional matters for me over the years and who had, fortunately, significant experience in estate and business disputes, met with me 2 days after I found the document. She reviewed what I had. The will, which clearly left the business equally to Dominic
Dominic and me. The document from the drawer, which was not a formal legal instrument, but which constituted a contemporaneous expression of my father's intent that predated the letter Dominic had presented. The timeline discrepancy between the two documents and what it suggested about the letter Dominic had used. She was careful and specific in her assessment. She said the will was the controlling document unless a subsequent valid modification could be established. The letter Dominic had presented claimed to be such a modification. For the letter to supersede the will, it would need to meet certain legal standards, it would need to be verifiable as authentic, it would need to represent a genuine change of intent rather than a coerced or fraudulent one, and it would need to be consistent with other evidence about my father's state of mind and intentions in the period when it was supposedly written. The document from the drawer was not a formal legal counter-document, but it was relevant to the question of authentic intent. A document written in September 2014 by my father, specifically stating his concern that Dominic would try to claim more than his share and specifically saying that his intention could not be changed by anything Dominic might produce, created a significant context problem for the February 2016 letter. "We need to verify the February letter," Judith said. "The handwriting, the notarization, the circumstances of its production. How do we do that?" "We start with a forensic document examiner. If the signature on the February letter is consistent with your father's handwriting, we move to the circumstances. Who was present, how the document came to be prepared, what your father's condition was in February 2016. My father's condition in February 2016 was significant. He was 2 months from death. He was on significant pain medication. His capacity in that period was something I had witnessed directly. He was not well in February, I said. He was still himself, mostly. But there were days when the medication affected him. He was not at full capacity every day." Judith nodded. "That becomes relevant to the question of whether, even if the signature is genuine, the document represents a valid expression of informed intent." We agreed on the next steps. The forensic examination, the inquiry into the notarization, the conversations with people who had been with my father in February 2016. The forensic document examiner was a man named Robert Chase who Judith had used in previous matters and in whom she had significant professional confidence. He examined the February letter, the document from the drawer, and a set of other samples of my father's handwriting, letters, checks, business documents, that we assembled to establish a baseline. His report came back in 3 weeks. The drawer document was consistent with my father's established handwriting patterns across multiple examples spanning many years. There were no anomalies. The February letter was more complicated. It was not inconsistent with my father's handwriting, which meant it could not be definitively identified as a forgery. But Chase identified several specific features that distinguished it from the other recent samples: a change in letter formation in certain characters, a different pressure pattern, irregularities in the signature that were consistent with either a deliberate change of style or with the physical effects of illness and medication. His conclusion: the February letter could not be confirmed as authentic with the same confidence as the drawer document. It warranted further investigation. What does further investigation look like? I asked Judith. The notary, she said. If the notarization was legitimate, there will be a record. We can examine when it was made, what the circumstances were, what identification was presented, whether there were witnesses, what the notary observed about the signer's condition. The notary in Passaic whose seal appeared on the February letter was a woman named Rita Campos. Judith contacted her office. Rita Campos was not available. She had retired in 2017 and had moved to Florida. After some effort, Judith's investigator reached her by phone. Rita Campos said she had no memory of notarizing the specific document. She acknowledged that the seal appeared to be hers but said the seal had been used for many notarizations during her years of practice and that she could not confirm or deny the specific one. She did say something that mattered. She said that in early 2016, her notary seal had been reported lost for a period of approximately 2 weeks. She had reported the loss to the relevant authorities at the time. After 2 weeks, the seal had reappeared, she had later found it in a coat pocket, and she had updated the report accordingly. The February letter bore a date during those 2 weeks. When I tell you that this information changed the shape of the situation, I want to be specific about what I mean. We did not have proof that the February letter was fraudulent. What we had was a pattern of irregularities that, taken together, produced a significant legal question about the document's authenticity. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive rather than definitive. The notary's lost seal, during exactly the period when the document was dated, was circumstantial. But the combination of these things, added to the drawer document in which my father specifically wrote that he was concerned about Dominic producing fraudulent documents, created a picture. Judith's assessment was that we had sufficient grounds to pursue the challenge formally and that the prospects for success were meaningful, not certain. She also assessed something else. She said, "Before we go to litigation, you need to have a direct conversation with Dominic. Not because you owe him that, you don't, legally, but because litigation is long and expensive and emotionally consuming, and because you need to know whether he will respond to what we have before you decide what the legal process is going to cost you." I agreed. I called Dominic and told him I needed to meet with him. I did not tell him what we had. I simply said there were things about our father's estate that needed to be discussed. We met at a restaurant in Clifton, a family restaurant we had both known our whole lives, which was either appropriate or ironic or both. The conversation with Dominic lasted 2 hours. I am going to tell you what was said honestly, which means I am going to tell you some things that are not flattering to me and some things that are not flattering to him, because the honest version of a difficult family conversation is always more complicated than the simplified version. I told him I had found the drawer document. He did not react with the immediate surprise I might have expected if he had no idea what I was talking about. He reacted with a quality I would describe as a shift in equilibrium, a brief reorientation, as though he had been walking in one direction and had encountered an obstacle he had not anticipated. Then he said, "That's just something Dad wrote. It doesn't mean anything legally." "I know it's not a formal legal instrument," I said, "but it establishes what his intent was in 2014, 2 years before the letter you presented." "He changed his mind," Dominic said. "The letter is what he wanted." "The letter from February 2016, I said, "when he was on significant pain medication and 2 months from death. He was still himself." "Some days," I said. "Not every day. You were there. You know what those days were like." He looked at his coffee. "The notary," I said. "Her seal was reported lost during exactly the 2 weeks when the letter is dated." A silence. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "The handwriting examiner had questions about the letter," I said. "Not conclusive, but questions." Another silence. "What do you want, Elena?" The directness of the question surprised me, though it should not have. Dominic had always been direct when he decided that a performance was no longer necessary. "I want what the will says," I said. 50% of the business. That is what Dad intended. That is what he wrote. It was his to give, and he gave it equally. "The business has been running for 8 months under my management," he said. "I've been here every day. You've been in New York. That is an argument for compensation for your time and labor during those 8 months," I said. "It is not an argument for ownership that the will doesn't support." He looked at the table, the specific look of someone calculating rather than feeling. Then he said, "The business is worth more with me running it than with a 50% split that creates conflict." "The business is worth what it's worth," I said. "And who runs it is a separate question from who owns it." "What does your attorney say?" "She says we have sufficient grounds to challenge the February letter in court." He picked up his coffee and put it down without drinking. "How much will that cost?" "More than resolving this directly," I said. "Which is why I'm here instead of filing." Dominic asked for 2 weeks before I initiated any formal proceedings. I gave him the 2 weeks. Judith was not enthusiastic about this. Her professional assessment was that delay gave him time to move assets, but I insisted, and we put certain protections in place to limit what he could do in that period. During those 2 weeks, Dominic apparently did several things. He consulted his own attorney, who I understood from subsequent conversations had given him an assessment similar to Judith's. The February letter was legally challengeable on the grounds we had identified, and the likelihood of successfully defending it in litigation was not high. He also, I believe, had a conversation with our mother. I do not know what was said in that conversation. What I know is that Teresa called me at the end of the 2 weeks and asked me to come to Clifton. My mother was 81 years old and declining. The house in Clifton that my father had left her was the house she had lived in since 1984, and she would not leave it. Not for anything, not for the senior facility my brother had suggested or the alternative living situations I had explored. She was in the house, with help that came in during the days, and she was managing with the determination of a woman who understood that the house and everything in it was what remained of the life she had built. When I came to Clifton, she was in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen. She said, "Sit down." I sat. She said, "Your brother told me what's happening." "He told you his version." "He told me a version," she said. "Tell me yours." I told her everything. The will. The February letter. The drawer document. The notary's lost seal. The handwriting examiner. The conversation at the restaurant. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your father told me about the drawer document." I stared at her. "He wrote it in front of me," she said. September 2014. We were at the table in the office, after the workday. He wrote it and I read it and he put it in the drawer. He said, "This is just in case. Dominic has always pushed and I want there to be something that says what I actually mean." "Mama," I said, "why didn't you tell me this in October when I started asking questions?" She looked at me with the direct gaze she had always had. A gaze that required courage to meet. "Because Dominic told me it would cause a fight," she said. "And because I was afraid of the fight. And because I have always been afraid of losing Dominic's good opinion, which is a thing I am not proud of but which is true." She was 81 years old and she was telling me a truth that had cost her to tell. I will not diminish the courage of that. "He told me about the February letter too," she said, "before it was produced. He said Papa had wanted to change the will and had put it in a letter. I should have asked more questions. I didn't. Did you believe him?" She looked at her hands. "I wanted to believe him," she said. "He is my son. It is easier to believe your son." "I am your daughter," I said. "Yes," she said. "And I am sitting here telling you this now." My mother's testimony, that she had been present when my father wrote the drawer document, that she had read it, that she had heard him explain his concern about what Dominic might do, was significant. Judith, when I told her, was more animated than I had seen her throughout the process. "This is a corroborating witness for the drawer document," she said. "An eyewitness who was present at its creation. That is meaningful. That is very meaningful." She drafted a letter to Dominic's attorney setting out our position. The drawer document, with the corroboration of Teresa's testimony. The February letter, with its forensic irregularities and the lost notary seal. The clear statement of intent in the will. The letter also contained an offer. Because Judith understood, and because I had been clear with her, that what I wanted was not a long and expensive litigation. What I wanted was the outcome my father had specified. The process by which that outcome was reached was of secondary importance to me. The offer: we would not pursue criminal investigation of the February letter's provenance if Dominic agreed to honor the will. 50% of the business, as specified. Compensation to him for the management work he had done in the months since my father's death, as a separate arrangement. A clear operational structure going forward. Dominic's attorney responded 2 weeks later. His client was willing to discuss. The discussions took 2 months. I will not take you through every session and every position, because the details are less important than the shape. What I will tell you is the shape. Dominic accepted the 50% ownership. The formal transfer was completed in the spring of 2017. He received compensation for his 8 months of management, calculated at a rate consistent with what an outside manager would have been paid for equivalent work at a business of Marchetti Supply's size. This was separate from the ownership question and was fair. The February letter was never formally adjudicated. The agreement between us superseded it. What the letter was, fraudulent, coerced, genuinely intended, remains, technically, undetermined. I know what I believe. I believe the drawer document represents my father's real and consistent intent, stated with the specific clarity of someone who knew what was coming and prepared accordingly. I believe the February letter was produced in circumstances that would not withstand examination. I believe Dominic knew this, which is why he chose to negotiate rather than litigate. But I cannot tell you it was definitively proven. This is the honest version. What happened with the business after the settlement is the part of the story that is, in some ways, the hardest to tell. The operational reality of two siblings as equal partners in a family business that one of them has been running alone for a year is not simple. There is no template for it that is easy. There is no version in which both parties are immediately comfortable and the transition produces immediate harmony. Dominic and I had to build a working relationship from the wreckage of what had happened, while simultaneously managing a business that had employees who had been working under a specific understanding of who was in charge and whose the business was. We brought in a business consultant in the summer of 2017, a woman named Andrea Calloway who specialized in family business transitions. She was clear-eyed and direct in the way of someone who had seen most versions of the situation and was not going to waste anyone's time with optimism that was not warranted by the facts. She told us, "The best outcome here is a business that works because you have clear agreements about who does what, not because you have resolved everything between you. You don't have to like each other. You have to be able to work together. Those are different things." We worked toward the different thing. Dominic managed operations. He was good at it. The relationships with clients, the management of employees, the logistics of the supply chain. This was genuinely his strength, and I did not pretend otherwise. I took on the financial management. The books, the accounts, the financial planning. This was my background and my expertise. I brought to it the specific advantage of not having been inside the business in a way that could have produced blind spots. I also brought something that I had not expected to bring but that turned out to matter. An outside perspective on certain relationships and arrangements that Dominic had allowed to drift in directions that were not in the business's best interest. Not because of any bad faith. I believe this was simply what happens when one person manages a business without oversight. Things slide. Arrangements persist past their usefulness. Costs creep. I addressed these things through the financial management role, carefully and without making them about our conflict. This was, I think, the most important thing I did in the first year of the arrangement. By the end of 2017, the business was in better shape than it had been in the year since my father died. The revenue was growing again. The client relationships were stable. The employees, who had been uncertain about the situation, had reached a kind of equilibrium with the new structure. This was not a happy ending in the simple sense. There is no simple happy ending when what you are trying to repair is a family and a business simultaneously. But it was a functional outcome. It was what my father had intended. I want to tell you about my mother during this period, because she is not a secondary character in this story, even though the legal mechanics placed her primarily in the background. Teresa Marchetti was 81 and 82, and then 83 during the years I am describing. She was declining in the physical sense of someone whose body was wearing out after a long life. She was not declining in any cognitive sense. She remained entirely herself, sharp, direct, occasionally infuriating, deeply loving. She told me, in the winter of 2017, something about the year after my father's death that she had not told me before. She said that during those months, the months when Dominic was managing the estate and when the February letter was being produced, she had known that something was not right. She could not have specified what she knew or how she knew it. But the specific instinct of a woman who had been married to one man for 49 years and who knew his handwriting and his voice and the way he thought and what he would have wanted, that instinct had told her something was off. She had not acted on it. She had been grieving and she had been ill, and Dominic was her son, and acting on the instinct would have required her to say something that would have made things harder, and she had already had all the hard things she could hold. "I should have said something," she told me. "Yes," I said. "But I understand why you didn't." "It doesn't mean it was right not to," she said. "No," I said. "But I forgive it. For the reasons you had." She looked at me with the directness she had always had. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. "I choose to. There is a specific thing I need to tell you about the drawer document, about what I understand of why my father put it there and not somewhere more formal. I have thought about this question many times. Why did he write it and keep it in the private drawer rather than taking it to Paul Ferretti and making it part of the formal estate record? He was a practical man. He understood the importance of paperwork. He had built a business on documentation. The best answer I have arrived at is this: he did not want to have the conversation that formalizing it would have required. If he had taken the drawer document to Paul Ferretti and incorporated it into the estate record, he would have had to tell Paul, and eventually tell Dominic, that he did not trust his own son. That he was concerned enough about what Dominic might do to specifically protect against it in the legal record. That the trust he had placed in Dominic, and the expectation he had fulfilled by employing Dominic in the business and by leaving him an equal share were not, underneath them, unqualified. He could not do that to Dominic. Or he could not make himself do it. The specific love of a father for his son made him unable to make the preparation visible. So he wrote the document and he kept it in the drawer, and he probably told himself that everything would be fine, that Dominic would honor the will, that the two siblings would work it out, that the drawer document would never be needed. It was needed. He was not there to provide it. But he had left it where I could find it. The question of Dominic and me, who we are to each other now, what the relationship is, how it has moved since the settlement and the operational arrangement, is not a simple one. We work together. This is true, and it is more than I expected when the settlement was finalized. The working together has produced something that is functional and occasionally genuinely collaborative, and that I would not have predicted in the early months of the conflict. We are not close. That is also true. The specific intimacy that siblings sometimes have, the easy reference to shared history, the in-jokes, the phone calls about nothing, is not ours. It was not fully ours even before everything happened. It is less so now. What we have is a specific kind of respect that has been built through the working together. I know what Dominic can do. He knows what I can do. We have found the arrangement that uses both of us well, and we have maintained it. This is not nothing. He has never apologized directly. He has made various gestures that, in the vocabulary of people who find direct acknowledgement difficult, constitute something in the direction of apology. Moments of visible acknowledgement that what happened was not right, moments of deference that go beyond what the operational arrangement requires, moments that I read as his way of saying things he cannot bring himself to say. I accept these gestures for what they are. I do not pretend they are the direct accounting I would have preferred, but I hold them as evidence that he knows. Whatever the February letter was and however it came to exist, he knows what my father intended, and he knows that he did not honor it in the first instance and that I had to force the honoring. He lives with that. I can see that he lives with it. That is not the same as forgiveness, but it is something close to the beginning of whatever comes after conflict in families that are not ready to fully resolve. My mother died in December 2020 at the age of 85. She died in the Clifton house, in her bedroom, which had been her bedroom since 1984, with the photographs and the rosary and the specific accumulation of 85 years of a life on every surface. I was there. Dominic was there. We sat on opposite sides of her bed, which is as close to symbolic as I will get, and we held her hands and we were with her as she went. After, in the hallway, Dominic and I stood together for a moment. He said, "She told me once that she wished she had been braver. After Papa died. She told me the same thing," I said. "She was braver at the end," he said. "Yes," I said. "She was." We stood there for a while. Not speaking. Just being, for once, in the same moment together without the business or the legal history or the years of complicated relationship between us. It was the closest we had been in a long time. It did not resolve anything. But it was real. Marchetti Supply is still operating. We have 21 employees now. Revenue has grown in each of the 4 years since the partnership arrangement was finalized. We expanded the warehouse in 2019 and added a fleet vehicle that same year. The business my father built from a single delivery truck is, I believe, in the best shape of its existence. I come to Clifton 1 week each month. The other weeks I manage the financial side from New York, where my home and my family and my accounting practice are. Robert, my husband, has been patient in the way that a good partner is patient, understanding that some things require more than a fixed amount of time to resolve and not demanding the resolution on a schedule that would make it false. My daughter Sophia is 16. She has grown up knowing that her grandfather built something and that protecting it required effort, and that protecting what people build is a form of honoring them. I did not tell her all the details until she was old enough to hold them. When I did tell her, she listened carefully and then said, "He put it in the drawer because he couldn't say it to Uncle Dominic's face." "Yes," I said. "That's sad," she said. "Yes," I said. "And it's also what saved everything." She thought about that. He was protecting you without letting you know he was protecting you. She said. That's exactly what he was doing, I said. That's what love looks like sometimes, she said. She is 16 years old and she understood something in that sentence that took me years to understand. I told her so. She received it with the specific grace of a teenager who knows she has said something true and does not want to make too much of it. The drawer document is framed. It is on the wall of my office in the New York apartment, not the Clifton warehouse. It is there because it belongs in my space rather than the shared space, and because I am the one who found it and the one whose life was changed by finding it. Visitors sometimes ask what it is. I tell them it is a letter my father wrote. They rarely ask further. What it says, in my father's handwriting in his mixture of Italian and English, is the specific thing he needed to say when he could not say it to anyone's face. That the business was for both of them. That Dominic would push for more. That the pushing was who Dominic was and should not be allowed to change what he, Carlo Marchetti, had decided. He was right about all of it. He saw it clearly and wrote it down and kept it where someone who needed it would find it. The someone who needed it found it. That is the story. I want to say something to anyone watching who is navigating something similar, who has a family member who is taking advantage of a grief period, or who is using the complexity of estate administration to obscure what was clearly intended. Document everything. If you have access to any documents that establish intent, letters, notes, anything in your loved one's handwriting that speaks to what they wanted, photograph them and secure those photographs somewhere that cannot be affected by anyone else's access. Find a good estate attorney before you need one. I had Judith. Christine Park helped Rosa Vega in a different story. The right attorney at the right moment changes what is possible. If there is a questionable document, investigate it. The forensic examination, the notary inquiry, the handwriting analysis, these are real tools that produce real information. They are not guarantees of any particular outcome, but they are how you move from suspicion to documented basis for a challenge. And if you are in the situation where the legal challenge and the family situation are both live simultaneously, which they almost always are, remember that they are separate tracks that do not have to move at the same speed. The legal track can proceed while the family track is still in the middle of its negotiation. The resolution of one does not require the resolution of the other. Most importantly, do not let grief or love or the specific vulnerability of loss be the thing that stops you from protecting what was meant to be yours. The people who take advantage of those conditions are counting on your vulnerability. Your strength in those conditions is the thing that disrupts their count. I visited the Clifton warehouse last month. It was a Thursday, which is the day I usually go. The trucks were coming in from the morning routes. The warehouse was loud with the specific sound of a working supply operation. The forklifts, the pallets, the calls between employees about inventory. My father's photograph is on the wall in the main office. the one that was taken the day the warehouse opened in 1991. He is standing in front of the building with his sleeves rolled up and his hand on the shoulder of the employee who was the first one he hired, and he is smiling in the specific way he smiled when something he had worked very hard for was actually working. I stood in front of that photograph for a moment. Then I went to my desk, the desk that is in the corner office that used to be my father's and that is now mine on the days I am there, and I sat down and I opened the books. The business is in good shape. It is what he built. It is what he intended for both of us. It is ours. My name is Elena Marchetti. I am 39 years old. My father built something from a single truck and 30 years of work. He wrote a letter and kept it in a drawer because he could not say it to anyone's face. I found the letter 14 months after he died. It changed everything. The business is half mine. My name is on it. My father's name is on it. Dominic and I work together with the careful respect of people who have been through something real and have found a way to be functional on the other side of it. My mother is gone. She was braver at the end. My daughter understands that protecting what people build is how you honor them. The drawer document is on the wall of my office. I look at it sometimes when I need to remember what it cost and what it was worth and why the two things are not in conflict. My father saw clearly. He prepared carefully. He trusted that someone who needed what he left would find it. I found it. I am still here. We are still here.